What's up, guys? It's Dakota, and I'm back with another deck tech this week. And this week I decided to choose Affinity, a deck that's kind of been a mainstay in Modern for quite a long time, at least for like the last few years. It's kind of always been a deck. It's a deck that people seem to gravitate to, a popular aggro deck in the format. And I mainly chose this one because it has like an interesting addition to the 75, which is Karn Scion of Urza, card that was recently released in Dominaria. And for a while, people were talking about like this card could be good. It might be too slow at 4, or too much mana, too mana intensive. But a Planeswalker that this deck could feasibly play on turn 3 or even turn 2 with a pretty nutty hand, and the fact that its -2 ability is super relevant because it makes some pretty big constructs. It can help you swing some races in your favor. I think that this card probably has a home in this deck. Maybe a 1 of, possibly a 2 of, if possible. I think this card's just great. It's doing a lot of work in Standard. It showed up in Legacy recently, and it was pretty good there, at least the times I got to see it on camera. So who knows where this card will be, but as long as it's in Standard, I think it's going to be a mainstay as well. But that's kind of my reasoning for choosing this list, is because Karn Scion of Urza shows up, and it's kind of a card that should fit in this deck. Whether it will stay there, we don't know. But with that being said, I'll kind of get into the rest of the deck. Basically, your game plan for Affinity is you dump your hand, you play a bunch of artifacts, you play a bunch of Ornithopters. Usually this deck plays Memnites, which this one actually is not, now that I kind of look at it a little bit closer. You play the Ornithopters, it's a 0/2 flyer, wears a cranial plating very well, which gives your creature, the equipped creature, +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and then you can activate its second ability, which is attaching it to a creature you control for double black at instant speed, which is a very good thing to do if you're trying to push through damage. They block all but one of your creatures, you just throw it onto the unblocked creature, and then you get through however many points of damage equal to the number of artifacts you have. So basically you have like Ornithopter, where's Cranial playing very well. Signal Pest, very hard to block, also gives some of your 0 power Ornithopters or your 1 power Arcbound Ravager, Vault Scourges, Etch Champions, what have you, and even your creature lands like Blinkmoth and Inkmoth Nexus. Gives them a little bit of extra power while also being able to get through damage. Again, also wears a plating pretty well. So does the Blinkmoth and Inkmoth Nexuses. Again, just the flying creatures that end up just being able to get through tons of damage, and you can even steal games with Blinkmoth Nexus or Inkmoth Nexus, dealing infect to your opponent while wearing a cranial plating. Can sometimes just one shot or even just 2-turn clock your opponent, which is still pretty good. The engines for this deck are usually Arcbound Ravager, Steel Overseer, Master of Ethereum can be sometimes a lights out card, and cranial plating. So Arcbound Ravager is weirdly kind of like this. It kind of non-bows with cranial plating because obviously Ravager can get bigger from eating artifacts and then just move all those counters onto another creature and make it super huge. While cranial plating only really affects the power, not the toughness. This does both, and it's obviously a permanent thing. So usually your preferred methods of trying to win the game are dumping your hand of all these nerdy artifacts and then playing either an Arcbound Ravager or a cranial plating on turn 2, being able to equip it to either a Vault Scourge or an Ornithopter and just start beating in for damage. Even a Signal Pest is fine, just getting in the damage. Steel Overseer, you can tap to put a counter on each artifact creature you control, and kind of a neat thing you can do with it, you can activate one of your creature lands in Blinkmoth Nexus or Inkmoth Nexus, and then tap the Steel Overseer to then just put counters on all of those creatures, and they'll keep those counters even when they become just lands at the end of turn. Vault Scourge is essentially just a 1-mana, 1/1 flyer with lifelink, and again, wears a cranial plating very well, can make races difficult when you have an Arcbound Ravager and a Steel Overseer, because even if you can get this thing up to a 5/5 flying lifelinker that just constantly hits your opponent, deals them 5, you gain 5, and they're hitting you for 7. Obviously, you're only taking 2 damage versus their 5, and you can easily win that race and take over the game. Etch Champion has protection from all colors as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. just pretty good. A 3-mana 2/2, even though that doesn't seem very good. Again, when you play cards like Cranial Plating, Steel Overseer, and Arcbound Ravager, a 3-mana 2/2 with protection from all colors is insane. And this card can easily be hard to deal with and get out of hand. And as long as you have Metalcraft, it's almost impossible to get rid of. And kind of rounding out the actual creatures, Master of Ethereum, which is a card that usually pops up at either one of, two ofs, or even threes or four ofs. You know, just obviously in that range of this card's either really bad or it's really good. But when it's really good, it's really good, and when it's bad, usually you're kind of already losing the game anyway. Master of Ethereum, its power and toughness equal number of artifacts you control, kind of like the constructs that Karn Scion of Urza makes. Their 0/0s, they get +1/+1 for each artifact you control, and then other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1, so giving an additional point of power to all of your random artifacts, I guess they're not really random, but all your other artifact creatures, your Blink Moth, Ink Moth, Nexuses, so on and so forth, just making them 1 point bigger. And then again, while being able to match it up with a Cranial Plating or even a Steel Overseer, it can really close out a game really, really quick if either of those cards go unchecked. If a Overseer, Ravager, Master of Ethereum, or Cranial Plating, like your opponent just doesn't answer for it, you're 99% to win the game. And that's kind of the draw to this deck, is the fact that you can play all these creatures, these very cheap creatures, and just any sort of like Anthem effect or way to pump them or way to make them bigger, any variation that you want to use of just that statement can make the game really get out of hand, and can just mean like a win or a loss depending on the matchup. The spells, really, like the only instants and sorceries you play are Galvanic Blast, which is just basically a 1 mana 4 damage to the face. It's a really good card when you're trying to race. It deals the last few points of damage that you need to close out the game if necessary. Obviously, sometimes you just end up killing with your creatures, but Galvanic Blast, putting your opponent at virtually 16 starting life total, and having a Cranial Plating, Arcbound Ravager, Steel Overseer, etc., just, again, makes the clock really quick, and you can just sometimes win on turn 3 or turn 4 just because you can hit for 16 total damage throughout those turns and then Galvanic Blast them for the final 4 points. Mishra's Bauble, which is kind of interesting. It's basically a slow cycler. You get some information on the top card of your opponent's library. I don't see why in this list where it kind of matters for you, because you're not playing any fetch lands, and usually when you can bauble yourself in other decks and look at the top card, and if it's a card you want to draw, you won't crack your fetch, but if it's a card you don't want, you'll crack your fetch, go get your land, and then just get a fresh card later instead of drawing that whatever card's on top. So Bauble, just a way to trigger more of your Metalcraft stuff to just another artifact to where it's 0 mana. You can essentially cycle it to draw another card at the beginning of the next upkeep, and then get some information on your opponent if you need to. Mox Opal, another staple for this deck. Like, always have a 4 of. Don't shave on this card if you can help it. Basically, just it's a free mana rock that will let you add any color to your mana pool, which lets you play cards like Dispatch, Ceremonious Rejection, and Ancient Grudge, along with being able to pay the black mana, or the Phyrexian black mana for Vault Scourge. Very, very good card. People have talked about it wanting to be banned, or talking about it possibly being banned, and making Affinity a little bit worse, but in reality, the card's fine just with the Metalcraft restriction, and this is really the only deck that can abuse it effectively, at least in my opinion, abuse it consistently. Welding Jar, sacrifice it to regenerate an artifact, gives you a little bit of protection, being able to protect your Steel Overseer, Arcbound Ravagers, and whatever Cranial Plating, or even whatever creature's Cranial Plated, while also, again, being able to win the races. Spring Leaf Drum, a way to turn just your random creatures into extra mana, especially good in this to pump out a Karn on turn 2 or turn 3. Just kind of again, another staple for the deck, kind of. It's good. It's good when it's good, and it's bad when it's not good. And then it's also more food for Arcbound Ravager. And then Cranial Plating, we talked about earlier, just one of the ways that you can just win races and steal games from your opponents. The lands, Blinkmoth and Inkmoth Nexus are the ones that you really want. 2 flying creatures that you just activate for 1 mana, and they are just 1/1 flyers. And then Blinkmoth with the added bonus of being able to pump either other Blinkmoth Nexuses or even Inkmoth Nexuses. So that's kind of a cool thing. Inkmoth is the one that you kind of want more than Blinkmoth because of Infect, and you could just turn the race into a 2-turn or even just win the game on the spot right there. You play 1 island. Most of your important spells are blue. Like, you want to be able to play Master of Ethereum, the Spell Pierces, and the Ceremonious Rejections in the sideboard. Cards that you want. And then obviously if you get Blood Moon or something like that, you can still cast the majority of your spells minus the Dispatch, but you don't care because you play the Drum and the Mox Opal. And then you have your kind of catch-all lands. The decks, like Affinity, have been going away from Glimmer Void, which is a painless land that you could just tap to add a color of any mana to your mana pool. But if you control no artifacts, then you have to sacrifice it. Spire of Industry fixes that because the 1 point of life sort of doesn't matter, because you can activate this ability if you control an artifact, but then it also taps for colorless mana, so you don't have to take a damage if you don't want to. Looking at the sideboard, and Darksteel Citadel, because it's an artifact land and it's indestructible, so it doesn't get blown up by Ghost Quarter or things of that nature. In the sideboard, Ceremonious Rejection, meant for the Tron matchups, the other colorless spell decks. I could see possibly bringing this in the mirror match, just to be a catch-all to Cranial Plating or any of their other like artifacts, because sometimes just that matters. I've played games with Death Shadow versus Affinity where I've had to Stubborn Denial a Mox Opal, because if I didn't, I would have actually lost the game. So yeah, Ceremonious Rejection, Tron matchups, Eldrazi Tron, maybe even some of the Ban Eldrazi decks, depending on the configuration and everything. Obviously what you see, that would be a case-by-case basis, and even the mirror match Ceremonious Rejection is pretty good. Dispatch is basically your Path to Exile with no drawback. Obviously at the floor, it taps a creature. Still pretty good when you're trying to race and everything. Exiling a creature is really good, because again it can just deal with a problem creature, and also again still helps you race. So very good card. Find one of them in the sideboard. Grafdigger's Cage, Collected Company decks, Counters Company, Snapcaster Mage decks, even the Hollow One decks. Mardu Pyromancer, even good too, just to stop their Lingering Souls and their Flashback Faithless Lootings. Still pretty good. Grafdigger's Cage, again, another fine one of. Relic, again, basically for those same decks minus the Collected Company decks. Relic just gives you something to do, another artifact, where at worst it draws you another card, or it just is food for an Arcbound Ravager. At best it kind of hoses whatever graveyard decks that you're playing against. Spell Pierce, another fine, basically a way to just jam your spells into early counter magic, or even just stopping a big planeswalker or something like that coming and hitting the table. You kind of have this counter spell for that. Ancient Grudge. Sometimes artifacts just suck to play against. Again, this is another card I would expect probably comes in the mirror for sure, just to deal with any problematic artifacts. Hollowed One decks. Turns out it's a 2-mana destroy target. Hollowed One is still pretty good, especially again in a deck that you are trying to race. And that's a point that I'll emphasize for probably the next few minutes in this video, is that you really want to try to race with this deck. It's where you want to hit fast and hit hard, and really just try to nickel and dime your opponent's life total until you can either Galvanic Blast them or clear the way for your creatures to get through and kill them. Blood Moon in the sideboard. I've talked about it in the Mardu Pyromancer video. Blood Moon just can straight up win you the game. So in a deck where feasibly it doesn't really hurt you to play Blood Moon, especially since you play the basic island, obviously you don't care, but if you're bringing in Blood Moon, chances are some of these other cards just don't matter in that matchup anyway, and you just rather play Blood Moon to try to stick it and really just try to tax your opponent's mana while also just basically making it harder for them to interact with you in your already fast start. Another edge champion. Oh, there we go. Another edge champion, just as another creature, races very well. Another hard creature to beat, especially when you give the fact that it has protection from all colors. Another card where if you are expecting to play a little bit more defense or playing against a little bit more artifact destruction, like Reclamation Sages and whatnot, Edge Champion's another good card to have just to be able to mitigate that. You want to see these more, and it'll be able to block creatures effectively and kill them. Gear per Aether Grid. This is interesting because I know Affinity decks have been playing this, and this card is amazing because it gives these other artifacts more utility. Because some of the, like, if you just have Springleaf Drubs laying around and you don't really have any pressure on board and you just have this Aether Grid, or even if you get Stony Silenced, you can just still tap these artifacts because it's the enchantment that has the ability to tap the artifacts, and not that you're trying to activate these anyway. So Aether Grid coming in against like decks that are playing Stony Silence, that could be playing Stony Silence, gives your artifacts actual utility rather than just being dead cards and not really doing anything. I actually missed Whip Flare. Whip Flare is essentially just a one-sided Pyroclasm. There's no creatures in this deck that aren't artifacts, and if they, for whatever reason, weren't, I mean, this is still just good for you. And like any scenario, this is really good against like any of the other creature decks. Just very, very good. Cannot emphasize enough. Very good card for this deck, because obviously Pyroclasm is good in every other deck. This one is just a strictly better Pyroclasm. And that kind of does it for Affinity. Just kind of looking at the deck, it's very good. It's one of those weird decks where it definitely rewards you a lot for knowing what you're doing and understanding the lines and just generally being able to do the math of what it wants. Being able to know when you can go all in on a Ravager and just put it on another creature and then either be able to protect it, or just knowing where you can pick and choose your battles, when to use your Galvanic Blast, when to sacrifice your artifacts, when to activate your lands, when to try and just kill your opponent in general. It all rewards you. Other than just, well, I can't kill them this turn, so let's go for it, and then getting blown out by Path to Exile, Fatal Push, and whatnot. So, kind of another important thing to know when playing this deck is that you wanna try to keep hands, and you want to really lean hard on having Arcbound Ravager, Steel Overseer, or Cranial Plating in your opening hand. That's 12 cards in your deck that you just want to have. Like, those cards could just end the game really quick. They go unchecked. And with this list in specific, Karn could also be a card that you keep if you just have a land, Mox Opal, Springleaf Drum, and a creature. You just need to draw one more mana source, which you would have 2 more Springleaf Drums, 3 more Moxes, and 15 lands to try to get there. And even if you didn't, I mean, 3 mana, you can cast everything in your deck but the Karn. So that's kind of my primer deck tech thing on Affinity. Affinity is a really powerful deck. It's a really fast deck, and if you're not prepared for it, you can just lose. It's kind of like the Dredges and the Storm decks of the format, where if you don't prepare for Affinity, you can just lose swiftly and not really have a chance to try and win the game, or to even stop them from just rolling you over and winning the game. So definitely be on the lookout for Affinity. I think next week I'm probably going to do a deck tech on humans. I was going to do it this week, but just kind of looking at the deck, it's just a weird list, and I kind of want to understand the sideboard better. Affinity is a deck that I've played against a lot, and I've played it a little bit myself. And it's a fun deck to play, and definitely if you like super aggressive decks where you just dump your whole hand, and then, you know, even just doing the math part of it's fun for you, and then I highly recommend this deck. As far as like competitiveness goes, this deck is very good. Definitely still tier 1. Definitely a deck that you still want to respect. And if you choose to play this deck, then I highly suggest that you just learn it. Just kind of dig in and just say, hey, this is the deck I'm going to play, this is the deck I'm going to stick with in Modern, this is the deck that I'm just going to play to death until it's either not good anymore or until something gets banned and it's unplayable. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Be on the lookout for the Humans deck tech next week, and I'll see you guys in the next video.